Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Is everything a distraction from the Epstein files? But when Donald Trump accuses Barack Obama of treason, what's next? Can the current US president try to arrest and prosecute his predecessor? And how would America and its institutions react to it? At this point, we cannot rule anything out. Professor of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, Donald Moynihan, told me. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. President Donald Trump told reporters that his predecessor Barack Obama had tried to lead a coup against him in 2016 and is guilty of treason over intelligence assessment that Russia had intervened to help Trump defeat Hillary Clinton in the campaign. On one hand, this is a clear distraction from the Epstein files, and I will come back to this later. But on the other hand, how do you assess such rhetoric from Trump? What kind of effect could it have on American politics when the sitting president accuses his predecessor that he is guilty of treason?
I think it's important to know that this is unprecedented. We really do not have any sort of reference point for this in recent American history, where a sitting president basically says a previous president was engaged in treason, was trying to overturn an election, was engaged in violence. The problem, of course, is that if anyone has actually earned many of those judgments, it would be Trump himself. So Trump yesterday talked to Congress, told members of his party if they get any questions about the Epstein files to refer to Obama, to remind them how violent Obama was, how he tried to engage in a coup. And so there is clearly a strategy here of trying to distract attention away from the controversy related to Epstein, very upfront about that and telling his supporters to bring that message to the press. But also, much of the language Trump has used about violence and coup and overturning an election is a description of his behavior in particular in 2020. And so it's unusual in American history for presidents to engage in this way in talking about their predecessors. In general, they tend to stay relatively quiet for a certain period of time. And it's beyond unusual and bizarre to make such outlandish claims. And, just to point out, obviously, Trump won the 2016 election. If there was some intervention by the sitting president to make sure that he wasn't going to win, that didn't work. Trump lost the election when he was in charge. And so the degree to which a president can take control of the administrative state and give him the presidential election is much more difficult than these conspiracy theories would suggest. But it ultimately is deeply destructive, and I think a sign of where we are in American politics, where we see tactics that we associate with other countries, that is to say, the president accusing his political opponents of trumped-up misdeeds, using government resources to investigate him. Maybe naively, we just think about that as un-American and deeply damaging, but so much of our norms and beliefs have been challenged in the last 6 months that it doesn't feel out of place with the current moment, even if it is jarringly out of place with American history.
Trump based his claims on the document released by Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence. She said that there is a passing evidence of treasonous conspiracy among Obama national security officials, and she recommended their prosecution. Would you say it is a case of politicizing and political abuse of intelligence services?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think when you look at the way in which Trump has filled his cabinet, the number one criteria is personal loyalty to him. I think there's a second criteria, which is that they're good on TV and they're skilled media professionals. But the primary criteria is that they will absolutely align with Trump. And so, for example, our head official of the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi, was Trump's personal lawyer. And I think it is not just a regime built on loyalty, it's the personal nature of this loyalty. And sometimes political scientists will use the term personalism to describe a party system or a governing structure that is built around not some shared ideals, but really about loyalty to one individual person. And that is pretty much where we are in the United States right now. Trump has created a personalist regime. And one of the first things he did when he returned to office was to focus on the law enforcement system, to fire lawyers who were involved in prosecutions against them, to replace them with personal lawyers or lawyers that he knew could be absolutely trusted to protect him. And so I think in the case here, you have a lot of these individuals competing to try to gain Trump's favor and attention and willing to say or do outlandish things in order to get that attention. And so everyone knows Trump is looking for a distraction. He's trying to change the headlines. And so the underling that allows him to do that is going to be rewarded and favored.
You mentioned that basically what Trump is saying about Barack Obama, we can say that he is somehow guilty of it. I'm referring, of course, you've also been referring to the January 6th of 2021. Does this event shape the American politics? And also the fact that Trump gave an amnesty to basically all perpetrators.
It's hard to overstate what a crucial moment that was in American history, even though it's still relatively recent. And I was in Washington, D.C. on that day watching news reports of these events happening just miles away from where I lived. And it was extraordinarily shocking. And I think there was about a 1 month period after that time when Trump as a political force could have been finished, where there was widespread bipartisan agreement, including from members of his own party who, remember, live in D.C., were in the room when it was being attacked, that Trump had gone too far this time in urging his supporters to sack the Capitol and overturn the election. There was genuine revulsion at that point. And at crucial moments, you have key political actors making the decision. And I think if we look back in history, congressional Republican leaders at that point, Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, chose not to push the impeachment case, which, if it had been successful, would have ruled Trump out from running again as a candidate. They knew that. In McConnell's case, he very clearly disliked Trump, believed he was a threat to the Constitution, but felt, I don't have to do anything because there's no way Trump is coming back from this. And in McCarthy's case, he was looking to solidify his leadership among Republican House members. And so he goes down to Mar-a-Lago, takes a picture with Trump. And that's the start of Trump's return to politics, is that moment when he could get some other senior Republican leaders to legitimate him. So I think that goes down as a missed opportunity. Even in the most recent elections, even though Trump had told us, I think the January 6th insurrectionists have been treated unfairly, it was still shocking to see them not just pardoned, but also to see the prosecutors who brought them to justice lose their jobs as a result. And so these insurrectionists are now celebrated. They're invited to political events. They're treated as political heroes. And the people who did their jobs in trying to defend democracy have been punished. It's symbolically, it's a very clear message about what happens when you try to defend American democracy under the current regime. Loyalty to Trump is valued as more important than loyalty to the democracy itself.
When Trump is talking about Obama and treason and coup, do you think that Obama can be arrested and prosecuted?
It would be truly extraordinary, but the number of times I've said it would be truly extraordinary or would violate our norms or it would be shocking in the last 6 months, I've lost count. At this point, we can't rule anything out. I mean, I think it would really shock Americans to see that. On the other hand, Trump released a video the other day that was AI generated, so it wasn't real, but the video portrayed Obama meeting Trump in the White House and then being arrested and forced to kneel before Trump. And so very much it is on Trump's mind and it plays to his base. I think it would be probably too far even for Trump at this point that he would understand the optics of arresting someone who's still a very popular former president, would just perhaps shake a lot of Americans awake. And, one thing I have been, I think, shocked by is even though Trump is now losing popular support, there's clearly 30 to 40% of the country that are not bothered by the democratic erosion that is taking place or simply not paying attention to it and sort of think about constitutional crises in very abstract terms that are unrelated to their day-to-day lives. Something like that might shock them enough to start paying attention.
Justin Terry, can you imagine that if they receive orders, the FBI or whoever jurisdiction it would be would refuse to arrest Obama or his former people?
I think what we found is that some people would refuse and Trump would fire them or they would resign. And eventually he would find someone who would agree. And this is sort of an amazing historical point. If you go back to Richard Nixon, an American president who was under investigation for breaking the law, at one point near the end of his presidency, he orders people in the Department of Justice to cover up his crimes. And one by one, even his own appointees refuse and they resign. And it became referred to as the Saturday Night Massacre. It is harder to imagine that happening today. It is, at this point, the way in which Trump has started to restructure power, he's given himself the right to fire civil servants. And so, even though this appears to be illegal as best as I can tell, he would be perfectly willing to fire senior civil servants or military officials for resisting such an order. And I suspect sooner or later you would find one of his supporters in a senior role who would be happy to implement it.
You mentioned Nixon and how, let's say, the system resisted him. It is a very different situation with Trump, at least from what you are saying. So what has changed in the US? Just because Trump happened, or there is something fundamentally deeper that has changed in America?
I think the difference with Nixon is that he eventually lost support from within his own party. Enough Republicans were shocked by his behavior that they told him he had to leave or he would be impeached. And that doesn't exist anymore. I think even today, if an impeachment process started, we know that Trump would not be impeached. It's happened twice before. And so the loyalty to party, and again, I think less to a set of ideologies, but to Trump himself, Trump's, for want of a better term, his supporters' loyalty to democracy. And, I think if you were talking to a Trump supporter, they would not see it that way. They would instead see Trump as the victim of a conspiracy theory and believe that efforts to undermine him were themselves undemocratic and unconstitutional. And so partly there's this gulf in America in worldviews where Trump has skillfully built a mindset and a belief system where he is at the center, he is defending freedom, he is the personification of white Christian American values, and an assault on him is an assault on everyone who holds those beliefs. Now, I think that view is wrong, and I think Trump is dangerous to the Constitution, but you have a lot of his supporters who do not see it that way. The final thing that I think is different from Nixon to this moment is the threat of physical violence. And the Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski went on the record about this a couple of months ago in ways that I think are sort of broadly known and understood, but not explicit. There are some Republicans who see Trump for what it is, but they know not only will they not be reelected if they oppose him, but they are concerned for their physical safety. It was also the case that former Senator and presidential candidate Mitt Romney was spending thousands of dollars a day on personal security because of threats against him. And so it's not irrational to have some of those fears after January 6th, after just relatively recently, politicians in Minnesota were murdered and shot by someone who supported the president. So it goes beyond a rational calculation about re-election or values. There's also this sense of personal safety that comes into it.
You mentioned Senator Murkowski, and it's interesting because, of course, she got the crucial vote when voting for the big, beautiful bill. And some people might even say that there were some political bribes for her. But I also wouldn't exclude that she was simply also concerned about her and her family's safety because, as you mentioned, the threat of violence is quite widespread. What do you think about it?
Yeah, and I think she's talked about this. The big, beautiful bill was so important for the Trump administration that the pressure to get it passed was immense. And Trump said things like, close your eyes and don't read the bill, just vote for it. And it matters because this is one way Trump has changed from his first administration, is he has learned a lot about the uses of power. So if you look at his first administration, he passes one significant piece of legislation before the pandemic, which is a tax cut. And that's basically it, even though Republicans control Congress for the first 2 years. He's in the same situation now with even narrower margins. And so he gets the party to rally around a tax cut. Again, that is the one thing all Republicans are for. But he also basically builds in the framework for his second term in that bill. And so it's partly a tax cut, but it's also a reimagining of the American government where we spend less on safety net programs and healthcare. We spend much more on the military and domestic policing and immigration via ICE. And so it was really, really important for Trump to get that bill past the line. And again, I think the pressure would have been immense. Like both, certainly the Senate and majority leaders viewed it as their job to get this passed because Trump would not accept failure in this case. Certainly Murkowski was offered a lot for her vote in Alaska. And I think then many of those promises disappeared very shortly afterwards. And she has said she felt like she was duped. But there was also threats and sticks along with those carrots to get her and others who are resistant over the line. It's significant that one of the other potential votes there, Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina, who ultimately voted against the bill, said he would retire rather than run again because of these sort of, I think, aggressive messages that Trump was directing towards him, where he felt like it was simply easier to say, this is going to be my last term in office because I can no longer be a Republican and be opposed to Trump.
Don, you just wrote that Trump's strategy for governing can be summed up by saying, grab them by the institutions, and we all know what it mirrors. So if the second Trump presidency is the big stress test for American institutions, how are they holding up? And I don't mean just public institutions, but also private ones. Some big tech companies and law firms basically pay Trump. Some universities surrendered to administration demons. And Stephen Colbert was canceled. And I can go on.
The short answer is American institutions are much more willing to align with Trump than they were in his first term. You saw, for example, leaders in Silicon Valley like Sam Altman or leaders of Google go to airports to protest the Muslim ban during Trump's first term, and they were at his inauguration in his second term. You saw private law firms that would have been suing Trump in his first term agreeing to provide legal help to him for free in his second term. We see media companies that were providing good coverage of Trump in his first term now paying him for alleged misdeeds and also maybe taking more critical reporters or satiricists off the air. So there's no question that the resistance to the Trump administration has been much weaker second time around. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The primary reason is that Trump, again, has just gotten better at using state power. And so the threats he is making now are much more credible. So he knows how to really destroy a private institution as well as public institutions. Where are their pressure points? How he can use state power to weaken them. And he's shown he's willing to do that. And in his first term, I think he didn't really understand the uses of those powers, didn't have the infrastructure within government of willing subordinates who would have helped him. And so it was much less costly to resist his anti-democratic actions at that point. And now the costs are much higher. And I think the second thing, and this is harder to estimate, is that I think some of these figures now agree with Trump and are on board with him, and sometimes for selfish reasons and sometimes for ideological reasons. Silicon Valley, I think, has been a fascinating example of that, where, historically it's this odd mix of liberalism where they're sort of broadly supportive in the sort of social domain, but also libertarianism, where they want to be able to do their own thing without much interference from government. And certainly a large section of that community now has abandoned the liberalism part, embraced libertarianism, partly because Trump has cultivated that constituency. He has supported deregulation of things like crypto. And partly they felt like, well, the Biden administration was too aggressive in its regulation of our companies. But there's also these cultural arguments where I think they also felt like we have a workforce now that is too woke and too into issues of workforce rights or individual rights, and we need to reestablish control of the community around us. And I'm sick of being criticized by people online, and so I'm going to embrace stronger use of authoritarian powers.
We already mentioned the Epstein files. Could you please briefly summarize the case? And from your perspective, what is the main problem associated with it?
I don't know if I'm the best person to summarize the case, because I've sort of long considered this to be a little bit of a distraction in American politics. I think that the key thing to understand is that Epstein is a figure that holds outsized importance on the American right. And so for a long time, Epstein is a figure that is central to conspiracy theories, especially online conspiracy theories, that have grown in the era of Trump. And this is one thing that is important to understand. There have always been conspiracy theories around abuses of power in American politics, probably more so on the political right than the political left. But what Trump was successful in doing is bringing these conspiracy theories into the heart of the Republican Party and using them as an animating force to engage his supporters. And so, Trump's political rise in the Republican Party is based on pushing the idea that President Obama was born in Kenya. He was the most visible figure who pushed the idea of birtherism. Epstein is this financier who's very well connected with people across American society. One of the central themes on the online conspiracy theories is that a lot of significant Americans are engaged in sex trafficking and pedophilia, And Epstein represents the most tangible human representation of that. And his connections with powerful people give some fuel to those conspiracy theories. The problem for Trump is that Trump was probably more connected with Epstein for a longer period of time than almost any senior political figure we can think about. And, certainly Bill Clinton knew Epstein and rode on his plane, but Trump had a long-standing friendship with this person that's pretty well documented. There's lots of pictures of them together. There's lots of third parties who talk about their friendship. And at this point, Trump is in a difficult position because his supporters were so hungry to see the exposure of Epstein's crimes. And then once in office, Trump's attorney general, Pam Bondi, basically said, there's nothing there. There's no real evidence beyond the official story. Epstein killed himself. He wasn't murdered. And that, I think, has really outraged the online right unlike anything else the Trump administration has done. And it has renewed attention to his friendship with Epstein. I think it has probably caused many skeptics like myself of the story to wonder why they are not doing more to simply share information, since this was so central to their political identity for so long. And it has gotten ridiculous. So at this point, Democrats in the House of Representatives instituted a procedural move that would have forced the Rules Committee to vote on the release of materials around Epstein. And the Speaker of the House, rather than allowing that vote to move forward, suspended the House and told everyone to go home early rather than have that vote, which is a really dramatic step to take. The refusal to talk about it hasn't killed the story. It's continued to breathe life into this very sort of complicated story. What is true and what is conspiracy theory, I don't know. But because it is so central to the belief system of Trump's supporters, it can't simply be dismissed in the way the administration has dismissed it.
So to wrap it up, it is very clear that Trump wants to make people forget about his relationship with the child sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The president is suing the Wall Street Journal, which published the details about the bizarre birthday letter Trump sent to Epstein for his 50th birthday. And as you mentioned, the U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson didn't allow the vote to release more Epstein files. All this raises serious questions. And we also see the friction within the MAGA movement. But don't you also see the risk that the liberals are creating their own conspiracy theories about Epstein files? Basically, like they're waiting, okay, it will be released and Trump will fall.
Yeah, I think there is some risk because potentially there probably isn't that much there. And there's certainly not new information. Like if you're just discovering that Donald Trump chased a lot of women, sexually assaulted some of them in the company of Jeffrey Epstein, like that information has been out there for a long time. And in his first term, there were literally dozens of women who accused him of unwanted sexual advances. So that in itself is not terribly new. I think there is some risk of liberals and Democrats going all in on this story. On the other hand, it seems to have more leverage than some of the more substantive topics, like the big, beautiful bill that was passed, I think is policy that will really hurt a lot of Americans. And I think it would be better if we were talking about that. But that seems to be less salient among Trump's base than the Epstein story. And, I think that in itself is a commentary on the nature of American politics right now, where the conspiracy theory is really driving political attention in a way that the substantive policies are not.
Yeah, it really seems that people are more interested in releasing of some almost now mythical files than if the hospitals in their neighborhood will be shut down.
Yeah, that's correct and depressing summary of the situation.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.